Hello once again, friends, and welcome to the Church at Lion of Judah Friday, July 12th service. This week we're blessed to have with us Darius Ernst of YWAM, Youth with a Mission, all the way from Cancun, Mexico, with this very special message titled, The Importance of Missions. We hope this message blesses you and your family for weeks to come. You know, it's always a blessing to see you online, but how about coming to join us next week? We're at 5732 Douglas Road in Toledo, Ohio. Service times are Sunday 10:30 a.m. and Friday at 7 p.m. Like to partner with us in support of the ministry and world outreach? Head over to www.lionofjudahtoledo.org. Navigate up to the Giving tab. Scroll down and fill out the information. And click Submit. Thanks so much for joining us today. Now on to the message.
Thank you guys as a congregation for receiving me once again. Last year I was able to come up here and I was sharing with Pastor Matthew at the beginning. I was a little nervous last year because I didn't know anybody and I didn't know what to expect. And this year, as he contacted me and I was planning and buying my plane ticket, there was an excitement in my heart because I said, okay, I know where I'm going, I know the people there, and I know about the party tomorrow. So you can't go wrong with good food. But it's great that you just took a moment to share right there, because that's exactly what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the relationship that we are meant to have with God. I want to talk about how it's not a religion. And for us, so often at the very beginning when we get saved, we have that excitement of relationship. We enjoy that privilege of what it is to walk in relationship with God. But then we get caught up in life. We get caught up in the routine. We begin to go through the daily schedules and we forget about that privilege. And we begin to overlook that opportunity of relationship that we have. But before I get into the preaching, I do have to make sure I say, because the guys in YWAM Cancun, they said, say hi to the congregation, say hi to everyone who was down there with us, and we look forward to seeing you guys in October again. And so I am excited to be able to share that message, especially on behalf of Yair. You mentioned Yair. When he heard I was coming up to Lion of Judah, he said, tell Pastor Matthew, thank you, because you guys were part of him getting to go to Vietnam and do a mission trip. And so getting to see what else you guys are doing as well in Israel and other parts, even locally, it is very exciting. So thank you guys for what you do just to bless others around you. I have a question I want to ask you guys. And this is a question that when I ask myself, I'm not always excited with the answer. I don't always get excited with what I see myself in my own heart, how I respond to it. But I want to ask you this question. What breaks God's heart? It's a question that oftentimes we overlook, because often when we come to God, we're not asking him, what do you think about this situation? We're not asking him, how does your heart feel in this situation? We come to him to tell him, this is what I'm going through. This is my difficulty. This is my pain. But we don't always stop and ask him, what is your heartbreak in this situation? And honestly, when I look at my life, there's times that it saddens me, because when I hear God's answer, it's not what I was thinking. Because I look at situations around me, I'm like, oh, that's sad, that's terrible. I should do this, this, and this. And I begin to move and I begin to work. And then when I ask God, what's breaking your heart in this situation? He highlights something completely different that I overlooked. And he takes me from a place of the superficial need to the heart need, to the root need. And it really goes back to just when I look at the big picture of what breaks God's heart, it's broken relationships. Because it's exactly what Pastor Matthew just mentioned. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship. And we can see this throughout the entire Bible. Everything that God is doing is about restoring relationship. It's about going to a deeper intimacy with his children. And he does it in a variety of ways. But when I learned to ask this question many years ago, God began to work in my heart. And he began to show me that this heart that he has that is broken because of the broken relationships, he gave us a task to do. He gave us a responsibility to do, to work towards that restoration of relationship. And that task can be done in a variety of ways. And we all have different roles in what we are meant to do. And it's very simple to see as you read Scripture. Every story in the Bible, everything you're looking at, it's God talking about his desire for relationship with us. It's a story of a loving father, a friend, a creator who was very intentional when he created Adam. When he spoke life into everything, it was just with his words. But he took the time to form Adam. He took time to breathe life into him. And what amazes me is when he formed him, he didn't just say like, oh, let's just be creative and just see what happens. Let's just snap our fingers. But he said, let us make man in our image. And it's not talking about the physical. It's not talking about what we can see here. But when he said, let us make man in our image, he wasn't talking to himself like a crazy person. It was the Father talking with the Son, talking with the Holy Spirit. They lived in unity. They lived in relationship. They understood what it meant to depend upon each other. And God said, let us make man in our image, people who need relationship, people who are meant to live in communion one with another and with us. How did God spend his time in the garden with Adam? He would come in the cool of the evening and walk with him. And he wasn't showing up with his checklist and say, Adam, did you do this? Did you do that? He came to walk with them, to have a conversation. It was an opportunity of connecting in relationship. It was a moment of the day that the Father looked forward to as he got to be with his creation, as he got to be with Adam, communicating, fellowshipping, hearing what Adam did, not as a checklist, but saying, Adam, I care about you, and I want to know what you've done today. Talk to me. What new animals did you name? What new things did you discover that I've created for you? But we know what happened with the fall. We know how sin came into our lives, and it destroyed our lives in multiple ways. But beyond just separating us from God in a spiritual sense, the relationship that was broken has caused more damage than we can ever understand. Because oftentimes we are looking at it from our end towards God. But God is also looking at it from the other end of the spectrum. A father who has lost his children. A father who longs for relationship once more with us. And it's a story. As you read through the Bible, you can see a father doing everything possible to reconnect with us. It wasn't that we deserved it. It wasn't that we earned it. It wasn't that we were making a way on our own, because nothing we can do is good enough to restore that relationship. But it comes from the Father. And you can see it when it culminates in that beautiful moment when the Father sends his Son. And he says, I'm willing to give up the most precious thing, my one and only Son. And I will send him to be imperfect like you guys, in a sense, where you have to suffer on this world. And we know that Jesus was perfect. And we know that he did not sin. But we know that he gave up his glory to walk on this earth as we do. And he was tempted in every way that we were tempted. And he suffered as we have suffered. He's a high priest who understands our situations. And it wasn't enough for him just to walk with us and just to teach the disciples. He went a step further. And he gave his life as he was beaten, as he was nailed on a cross. For him, it was worthwhile to restore relationship with us. So when you ask God, what breaks your heart? All you have to do is begin to look around and see all the people who are lost. All you have to do is to look at your neighbors, your co-workers, the ones that go to school with you, the ones that do not know the Father. And it's not because of the religious sense. It's not because, oh, they need to get saved so they can go to heaven. Because that's a very short-sighted way of looking at it. Just saying, well, let's just get them saved so they can go to heaven. But they have that whole space between salvation and the end that's called life. And it's a life that we are meant to live in relationship with God. Because if the only thing was heaven, when we got saved, we would be gone. But Jesus leaves us here with a purpose and a task. And he gives us that ability to have relationship with him now as just a little taste of what will be in heaven. And I know I get frustrated There's times I get really frustrated. I'm saying, God, I just want to see your face. I just want to hear you a little clearer. I want to know a little better what it is that you're saying to me. But I know we're not at that time yet. But God loved us so much. God hungered for a relationship with us so much that he sent his son to die. And our work as believers, because we are co-workers with Christ, is we are to participate in that process of helping other people restore relationship to the Father. And it's not because salvation comes through us, because we know it comes through the Father who sent his son to die for us. But our task, our responsibility is to go and share the good news. When I look at my life, when I think about how I got saved, it wasn't because I was a great scholar who began to study the Bible and understand its great riches. It wasn't because I was out looking for the way, the truth, and the life. It was because somebody came to me and said, you know what? You're a sinner. But they said it with such love. Because I was in a place of hurting. I grew up, my parents are missionaries in Alaska. I grew up in Alaska. So I should have been this great kid who knew all the right answers. But like so many, I walked away from the Lord. And when I was in this place of depression and seeking and lost and hungry for reasons and purpose in my life, there was a young girl that came and knocked on my door. I just spent all night just challenging God and questioning his reality. And a young girl comes, knocks on my door and says, Jesus is real. He loves you. And you need him. And it was through the efforts of this young lady that my life was transformed. I have no idea where she's at in this world. I don't know what she's doing. But her few moments that she took to come to my house changed everything about my future. And it's something that we are all called to do as Christians and as believers, as sons and daughters of the living King. And we need to understand, because I know what it feels like. I know how hard it can be to go out and to evangelize. I know how embarrassing it can be to go and talk to some stranger that you don't know, and you don't know if they're going to accept your message. I know what it's like to knock on doors and say, hi, can I? And then the door closes. I know what that feels like. And so it's easy because there's a lot of excuses for us to say, you know what? I'm not going to do it today. But when we stop and we ask God, what breaks your heart? And he begins to point out to your neighbors and your coworkers that are around you who are lost and hurting, our hearts should break. And it's not a matter about what we feel. It's not about a matter of our embarrassment, because just hearing the Father say, my heart's broken because they don't know me. That should be enough to motivate us out of love to go and speak to them, to share with them. And when we talk about salvation, there's, like I said, there's more than just getting to heaven. Because we are to walk out our faith and we are to grow in our maturity. And I think about in Matthew chapter 6, and the disciples, they're looking at Jesus and his example, and they say, Jesus, we see you talking to the Father all the time. We see you in this great line of communication. How do we pray? How do we imitate what you are doing? And so Jesus took the time to teach them. And he says, if you are going to pray, pray in this manner. And he says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And he goes on to teach a little more, but this is a powerful example. This is a powerful thing for us, because he says, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The Father is not just waiting for eternity to have relationship with us. He has an expectation. Go ahead, have a seat. Thank you. He has an expectation of relationship with us now. He's not having wishful thinking when he says, oh, I just wish that heaven could come down on earth. I wish you could experience it. He says, let your kingdom come and your will be done. He says, let it come. Not I wish it could come. He said, let your kingdom come here onto earth. But how is that going to happen? How is it going to happen where God's kingdom comes here? God had a strategy. God had a plan. And it's you guys. It's me. He said, I want my kingdom to come onto this earth, but it's going to happen through my children. They are the ones who will participate. They are the ones who are going to bring this kingdom upon this earth. And we know that it is not about us and our name and our glory. It is about his name and his glory. Now, I have not been to heaven, so I don't know what it looks like. I know it's a lot better than here. But I really hope there's a lot of good mountains up there. And snow. I live in Cancun, Mexico, and you guys think that is paradise, but it is hot, and it is flat, and the biggest mountain is a speed bump. I grew up in Alaska, where there's mountains and snow and nature and no people, and it was beautiful. I loved it. So I'm hoping heaven has a lot of space for me. But he says it's not about just that, because heaven is once again that restored relationship that we get to have with the Father. Heaven is going to be just like Adam, where I can go up to Jesus and say, hey, you want to go for a walk? And we're going to go for a walk. And we're going to have clear communication. And we're going to be able to, I'm going to see his face and know what he looks like. I'm going to get to hear him breathing. Like the song was talking, to hear his heartbeat. I want to hear his heartbeat. I want to be that close. I want to have that restoration of relationship that breaks his heart. I want to see it come. There's two parts to this task. And today I'm going to focus on one part, and Sunday I want to talk about the second part. But when Jesus said, your kingdom come on this earth, your will be done on this earth as it is in heaven, it was something that he believed was happening. It was going to happen because of what he did on the cross and what we were called to do as his believers. And in Mark 16, this is dangerous, because anytime you invite a missionary to come teach, you know what he's going to teach on. He's going to teach on missions. He's going to teach on go out and preach the gospel. It's what I'm excited about. In my church in Cancun, anytime the pastor can't preach and he say, hey, Darius, can you preach? I start praying, Lord, give me a message, give me a message. Give me something new to say. And it's always back to missions. But that's okay, because that's what I love and I'm excited about. And it's not just because it's my job. It's a privilege and a calling that I have. And I know not everyone is as lucky as I am getting to go out. But it is okay, because we all have a part. But I want to read from Mark 16, verses 15 and 16. And I'm sure you guys already know what it says. But Jesus is saying, he says, go into all of the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Now, I am not an English major. I'm not very good at English in school. When I was trying to get through school, my teacher looked at me, my English teacher looked at me at the end of the school year, and she said, you did not pass, but you sure did try hard. So I'm going to give you a passing grade. So I'm not good at English. So when I have to look at studying language and verbs and nouns and all that, it takes me a little extra time. But when we look at this verse, there's an important verb in there that we need to look at. And that verb is preach. Because God is assigning us a task. When we look at the Bible, some people say it's a big book, but it's a very small book. And when you look at the part where that's read, where Jesus has spoken, there's not a lot there. Because Jesus was living and working for 3 years, preaching and teaching, and there's a lot that is not in Scripture. And it's not a mistake. It's not that he forgot to add it. He was very intentional what he put into God's word. What we get to have today is not an accident. It is God-breathed, and it is ordained by him for us to have. and he knows how to speak to us through it. And in this passage, he says to his disciples. Now, there are some people who will argue, well, this was a message for his disciples, but not me. They're the ones who need to go. But if we want to take that mentality, most of the Bible then would not apply to us. But the reality is we know it is applicable to us. And so when Jesus was talking to his disciples, the apostles, and all those who were gathered around, he says, I'm leaving. My job is done, but your work is starting. And so I want you to go and preach the gospel. It is a very direct command for us, and it is a very simple command. And Jesus wasn't talking to the select few, the apostles. He was talking to the believers. He was saying, this is your task. Because he wants his kingdom to come here on earth. But that will only happen when we go and preach the gospel. We are to preach the good news of salvation. We are to preach that Jesus died on a cross to save us. Because people need to hear this. For 3 years, the Lord was out working among the disciples, preparing them, training them, and then he sends them. And he says, you have an evangelical work to do, and you must go and preach the gospel. Who are they to preach to? Just their neighbors? Just the friends? It says, go and preach the gospel to all creation. Once again, that's a big task. If you grew up where I grew up, it was a town of 250 people, so it wouldn't take too long. You could do that in just one day. You just walk around and say, hey, Jesus loves you. But where I live now in Cancun with over 1 million people, it was going to take me a while. It's not a task that I can do on my own. It's not a task that is just for a select few people. It's not a task for the pastors or just the elders. It is a task for every single believer. Because you guys know people that I will never meet. And Jesus is very clear when he says, go and preach the gospel to all creation. He's talking about every single human being. This is a very singular task. Because he's not talking about something that is multi-generational. He's talking about the creation that is alive. Because you cannot preach the gospel to those who are already asleep. You cannot preach the gospel to those who are yet to be born. You cannot preach the gospel when you are gone. You have a very limited opportunity right now to do this. And we are called to preach the gospel. It's not an option. He didn't say, if you feel like it, go and preach the gospel. If you're in a good mood, preach the gospel. If your football team won that day, go preach the gospel. He says, preach the gospel. And it is a responsibility that each one of us have. That girl that came and preached the gospel to me when I was a young, reckless man, she changed my life. She doesn't know it. She lost contact with me. But she changed my life because she preached the gospel. This task that God gives us, he believes that it is possible. And it is a task that has a great urgency. There are times that I get shy. There are times that I'm nervous to preach the gospel. I will be honest. I'm human just like you guys. But it's not an option because there's an urgency behind this. I don't want to go and stand before the Father and just say, well, I'm glad I'm saved. Too bad about them, though. Because he's going to look at me, he said, but they needed to hear the message. And I sent you. But you were embarrassed. You were busy. You were occupied. You didn't want to take the time. It was too hard. You had to say it too many times. He's not going to give me an excuse. He's going to say, they needed to hear the gospel message, and I sent you. I want to be able to stand before the Father and say, Lord, I was faithful. And it's not about how old you are. It's not about your job. It's not about your position, a title. It's not about your paycheck. It's not about where you live. It's about being the son and the daughter of the living God, who is willing to share the message with those who are around them. It doesn't matter if you're at the checkout counter and you take a moment extra just to talk to the cashier, just to give them a word of the Lord, to encourage them, to find some time to talk to your neighbor, even the grouchy one. We all have grouchy neighbors. Where our ministry is, the day we were pulling in to move into the house, a gentleman across the street stepped out and began to film us very angrily. And so we asked the neighbors, "Who's this gentleman?" And they're like, "Oh, that's Mr. Grumpy. And he's here just to kick everyone else out." And sure enough, every few days the police would come by because there was some complaint that he raised because we were just a little too loud when we were worshiping or we were out having fun. And so in good faith, we changed his name from Mr. Grumpy to Mr. Happy. He hasn't changed yet, but we believe it will happen. And we go out and we smile. And when he begins to film us, we wave. And when he calls the police on us, they come and they're like, "Oh, it's you guys again. Keep doing what you're doing." And they drive off. Mr. Grumpy needs to hear about Jesus. That way he can truly become Mr. Happy. And in faith, we're going to keep calling him that. It's not because he's the easy one to go and talk to that I'm going to go do it. He needs to hear the good message, the good news, the gospel, just as much as I needed to hear it. The command that God gives us is very simple, because that object of that verb of preaching is to all creation. Every single individual has the right to hear the good news. But Jesus assigned us that task. And in Hebrews 9:27, it's written that all of us are destined to die once, and after that we will face judgment. We don't have a second chance to go around and try again. We only have one opportunity, just like everyone else around us. Each one of us only has one chance. We only have one life. And I believe that my neighbors, I believe that my friends, I believe about the people that are across the street that I don't know, their life is just as valuable as mine. And if I was given the chance to hear the good news, they need to have the chance to hear the good news. So I want to challenge us as believers, as brothers, and as sisters to rise up to the task. Because this task that Jesus gave was not for the missionaries. It was for his children. He says, "Go out and preach the good news." And it's interesting because also in Matthew 28, we also see the Great Commission. In Matthew 28:19, it's written the Great Commission, but it's written differently. There's a different focus and a different emphasis on what is being spoken. The first one is to preach to everyone with a great urgency. But here in Matthew 28:19, it says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." The first is to preach, and this is to make disciples. To preach is a quicker, easier task, but to make disciples is a long-term investment. To make disciples actually requires much more sacrifice than preaching the gospel. If we actually understood how complicated it was to make disciples, everyone would be out and doing evangelism, and everyone would avoid the discipleship. I'm grateful for those who disciple, because I look at my own life and I look at the problems and the mistakes and the failures and the patience of those who helped me. They look at me and they, "Darius, you did it again." Yep. All right, let's start over. Let's try this one more time. Start at the beginning. Start at the basics. The Great Commission is twofold. Oftentimes we just talk about the Great Commission. Yeah, go preach the gospel. That's the first step. That is a requirement that we all have to fulfill. But the second step is the discipleship. And it's of nations. The first one was all creation. The second is nations. God cares about the individual, but he also cares about the group, the nation. In the Bible, there's only 2 times that it's mentioned that Jesus wept. The first is when his friend Lazarus passed away, which shows the concern for an individual. And the second is when he wept over Jerusalem, which is showing how he cares for a corporate. His heart goes out to the individual, but his heart goes out to the nations as well. And his heart is that we as Christians would disciple a nation in serving him. When Jesus brought Israel, the nation of Israel, out of Egypt, he took the time to form them. He didn't just free them and say, okay, run along and figure it out. He walked with them through the desert, and he gave them his instructions. He gave them the laws. And it wasn't just religious laws. When we read the Bible, sometimes we get locked into this mentality that everything is religious. But so much of what the laws were about had nothing to do with religion. It had nothing to do with how they were to celebrate their faith. But there was so much about economics, how to have fair economics, about health care, about how to take care of the land so that their crops could produce more. God was a God who cared about an entire nation and every sphere of that society. And his goal was to raise up a nation that sought after God and that would set an example and be a blessing for other nations. We are meant to disciple nations. And that is a big task that God has given us. Pastor Matthew, do you feel a big task discipling a church? Are you ready for the nations? The Lord will send you. The Lord shows us the importance. And on Sunday, I want to take a little more time to talk about the discipleship process and the different steps and the spheres we are supposed to influence. But we cannot get to discipleship if there's not first salvation. We cannot reach a nation if we don't first reach the individual. And so we have to preach the gospel, and there needs to be an urgency within our heart to go and to do this task. And it sounds like an enormous task, but it is not impossible. It is so important for us to take the time to share the gospel message. It is a task that God is expecting each and every one of us to do. I remember when I was a little kid, and before I had gone wild and deviated from the ways of the Lord, I remember watching my parents as missionaries and hearing the message that my dad would preach and seeing how they would work with the people. And I began to think, that's pretty neat. If God cares about all these individuals, I wonder what my job is. And so I asked my dad, what can I do? How can I help you? And he says, well, I'm reaching out to these adults and to these parents, but you can reach out to their children and you can share the gospel with them. And so I remember just being a little kid going and sharing the gospel with sincerity and with great boldness. Jesus said we are to have the faith of a child. I was more bold then than I am now. I was less afraid then to share the good news of the gospel than I am now. Because then I understood the beauty of it, the purity of it. And then now, well, I'm busy. I have things to do, responsibilities to fulfill. These are all excuses that will not stand against the end of time when I am before the Father. And he says, what did you do with this task? God has assigned us this responsibility of preaching the gospel. When I walked away from the Lord and I came back to him because of his mercy and his grace, I remember saying, Lord, what is my purpose? What is my call? What do you want me to do? And I remember him speaking very clearly to me. And he said, I did not save you just for your own good. I saved you so that you might serve me. And so in my innocence and my naivety, I said, Lord, here I am, send me. And I did not understand what that meant. But my heart was crying out that all I wanted to do was to serve him. And as he began to lead and guide, he says, go and be a missionary. I didn't know how to do that. I grew up as a missions kid, but I didn't know how to become a missionary. And so I began to pray, and the Lord led me into YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. And the whole idea of YWAM is to train up young people to be missionaries. To train up young people that when they go home, it doesn't have to be another country, but when they go home, they know God. And they have a relationship with him. And they're passionate about that relationship. And they share with those who are around them. And so I ended up going to Colorado to train up as a missionary. And as I began reading all these books about great missionaries, I thought, okay, to be a real missionary, I need to go to China, to India, to Africa. I need to suffer. I need to not like the food. I need to have all these problems, which I do like all the food from all those places. But I said, Lord, send me to these places. And he kept sending me to Mexico over and over. And I said, Lord, why Mexico? That's for high school youth groups. I can do more for you. And he kept sending me to Mexico. 17 years ago, I moved to Mexico, not knowing what was to come. But I went because the Lord said, go and preach the gospel to all creation. It wasn't up to me to choose where. It wasn't up to me to choose how. It was up to me to say yes and to go. And I have had the privilege and the blessing to be down there for 17 years. Cancun, Mexico is a beautiful place. It has the most amazing beaches, a great ocean. Every time I fly out of Cancun, I get to see it. That's about the only time. I don't really like the ocean that much. But it's a beautiful place. But there's a dark side to Cancun. Because Cancun is like the Las Vegas of the U.S. It exists so that people can have fun. It exists so that people can go and live out their desires of their flesh. Cancun every year ranks at least within the top 5, usually in the top 3, for the highest rate of divorce, the highest rate for broken families, the highest rate for suicide, the highest rate for child trafficking. It is a place that is dark and full of sin. But God said, go and preach the gospel. And it's not that I'm better than others in doing this task. Ask anybody who speaks Spanish, and if I speak Spanish with them, they will laugh. They will say, good effort. You sound like a gringo. I cannot get rid of my accent. I don't have the right grammar. They're better at it than me. But God said, go. Where is God sending you? Where is God wanting you to serve? Where is he wanting you to preach the gospel? I love the fact that I get to serve in Cancun. There was a small community, Kunamaya, that God put on our heart. We were in a time as leaders of prayer and fasting, asking God, where can we work? What can we do? And he showed us a community, and it is a squatter's village. And it's changed so much since we began working there. But 10 and a half years ago, God said, work in this community and transform it. And I said, well, how do we transform it? And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to start discipleship groups for adults. We're going to have all these great things for adults. And God said, work with the kids. I love kids. Kids are the most amazing, fun thing in the world. They're the greatest toy in the world. But to teach them, forget about it. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to teach my daughter when she's coming to me with homework for math. I'm just like, I don't know. Comes to me for English, talk to your mom. I don't know how, but God said, work with the children. And so we began to go into that community. And for an entire summer, we went door to door to every single home to take time to hand out Bibles, to tell the people why we were there and what we were going to be doing, to take time to pray for them. And we started out a children's program with 15 kids. And then it grew and it grew to where we had over 200 children coming every Saturday. And then the Lord said, that's a good start, but you need to do more. Start a school for these children. I want a Christian education for these children. And so we began to pray into it. None of us were teachers. None of us were qualified. None of us knew how to do a school. Until one day, a Christian school contacted us and said, hey, we want to sponsor 5 of your children for a free education. And then they called us and said, send another 5. And they called us later and said, send 3 more. And so I was excited. I said, Lord, there's your school. And he said, no. A year later, that school called us and said, you know what, we're having difficult times. We cannot receive your children anymore. But those kids were already out of the government system, and they had no future unless we were able to start a school. And we prayed. I remember very clearly, it was towards the end of December when we got that phone call. And as leaders, we were on a trip, and so we prayed as we were driving, and we said, Lord, what do we do? And he said, I already spoke years ago. Start your school. And so on February 4th, we began a school. And in that short time period of a month and a half, less than a month and a half, another school donated school supplies. A school donated desks. Some people came in and taught us how to be teachers in emergency mode. And it was a beautiful thing. And then the fruit of what that is. Because as we have those kids every day, we get to preach the gospel. We get to share with them. And I've had the privilege of baptizing 2 of those kids. 2 of them did missions training with us. 2 of them, the ones that you guys know, went to Vietnam. And there's more. In September, another one is going to be doing missions training with us. Last year, another one got saved. And so we're beginning to see the fruit of that work. But we have to be faithful with going and sharing the gospel. One of the special moments in the 10-year anniversary that we had is a mom came up to me, and I didn't recognize her because I hadn't seen her for a while. And she had her daughter with her who was about 22. She was in school studying in the university. And the mom said, do you recognize me? And I was like, I'm sorry, I don't. And she said, 11 years ago, you were knocking on doors in this community. And she said, you and your team came into my house. And sadly, at that time, I was the one translating for the team, so I don't know how much was clearly communicated. But I went into the house, and we very briefly shared the gospel, handed out a Bible, and asked if there was a prayer request. And she said, yes. I need 3 things. I need a job, I need a house, and I need a husband. Because she was living in a difficult situation with kids that were depending upon her. And so I turned to the team, I said, let's pray for these 3 things. And very confident, I said, a job and a house. And I was like, and a husband. I didn't have much faith for that prayer. But the team in great faith, it was a team of youth. They said, we will pray. It took them like 30 seconds and they were done. And so we turned and we walked away. When that mom was sharing with me, she said, that day that you came to my house, my children were not there because I'd sent them with their grandmother so that I could commit suicide. And she said, I was hanging up my rope when you guys knocked on my door. And she said, when you guys came in and prayed for me, I thought maybe there's hope. I'm going to give it a chance because you guys shared the gospel and you said there's hope in Jesus and you prayed for me. And so I prayed. And as she's sharing this story, she's crying and her daughter is crying. And she said, shortly after you prayed, I got a job. She said it was just a few days. And all of a sudden, my kids who were starving, they had food. And just shortly after that, a man came into my life. And he's a good man. He's not an alcoholic. He doesn't beat me. He provides for me. And he built me a house within a year. Who did that? God did that. So many times we take the responsibility on ourselves to change the lives of individuals, but that was not the task given to us. Jesus said, go and preach the gospel. That's all we have to do. It is very simple. When we take that bold step, which we think is so bold, and go out to tell others who Jesus is, all we're doing is we are opening a floodgate of blessing into that person's life. Because when God comes in, he begins to move. He does things that are beyond our understanding. That lady, her life was transformed. Not because of what we did. Because all we did was be faithful to a simple task of preaching the gospel. Just a few months ago, I was doing one of my favorite hobbies, which is going and eating tacos. We went out. It was late at night. Late night tacos taste better than any other time of day. And it was really late at night, and we went to this taco stand where they were nice and cheap, and I was getting a big plate, and a lady walks up to our table, and she says, do you recognize me? As always, nope, I'm sorry. And she began talking to us. She said, I used to live in Kunamaya, where you guys work. And she said, you guys came to my house and prayed. You guys handed me a Bible, and you told me about Jesus. And it was almost a similar story, where a life of suffering and difficulty. But because someone preached the gospel, she said, I'm going to give God a chance. She no longer lives in that community, as God has blessed her so much she was able to move out and has a stable job and a good home. But it's amazing to see one day of preaching the gospel, and then years of not seeing them, but to hear the stories of what God has done. We have a responsibility and a task, and this is for each and every one of us. And it can be when we go on mission trips, and it can be when we go to work. It can be when we are at our house resting in our neighborhood, but we are to preach the gospel. It is a simple responsibility that Jesus gave his disciples, his sons, and his daughters. Go and preach the gospel to everyone. Leave no one out. Ignore nobody. Do not judge anybody, but preach to all and every. Go from everywhere to everywhere and share the gospel message. It is a call to all. And so I want to encourage you guys to be bold. You may not see the fruit. You may not see the results, but it is okay, because God is faithful and God sees it. And I am excited for the day. I am excited for the day that we are in heaven and it's crowded. And we look around, we're like, well, how'd they get here? Who's that? And the Lord can begin to tell the stories. When you say, oh, I remember Noah went and talked to this kid, inviting him to youth group, challenging him to come and be part of it. Because of that, I worked. I'm excited to hear when God says, oh, there was a team from Lion of Judah that went to Cancun. They didn't speak the language, but they shared the gospel. That's why this person's here. I'm excited to see how God uses our lives of obedience to help fill heaven. But tomorrow, Sunday, I want to talk about the discipleship of nations. Because when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he says, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Preaching the gospel helps get people to heaven, but discipleship helps bring God's kingdom here on earth.